Selamun Aleyküm. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Vessalatu vesselamu ala Resulina Muhammedin seyyidil evvelin ve ahirin. Meded ya Resul, meded ya Sadat, ashab-ı Resul, meded ya Şahı. Destur Mevla Şahbullah Fazla Hasan Şah Muhammed'in hakkani medet. Tarikatuna as-suhba vel hayru fil cemiyye. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ve ma halaktul cinne vel insa illa liya'budun. Ma uridu minhum rizqan ve ma uridu en yut'imun. Sadakallahul azim. Allah Azze ve Celle bizi ne için yarattı diye bazı insanlar, çoğu insanlar,
many people ask, why did Allah Almighty create us?
yaratılış hikmetini bilmezler.
Most people don't know the purpose of their existence and the wisdom behind their creation.
Allah Azze ve Celle buyuruyor, insanlar, cinleri ibadet etsinler diye yarattım diyor.
But Allah Almighty makes it very clear that He Almighty Allah says, I've created men and jinn only to worship me.
Hikmeti budur. Bunu bilen,
to worship Allah Almighty is the wisdom behind our creation.
Kafasını yormaz.
And those who are aware of that wisdom, they don't trouble their minds.
Sıkıntıya girmez.
Who are aware of that wisdom, knowing that Allah Almighty created us to worship Him, won't put themselves into stress.
Bunu bilmeyen hiç bir fayda olmayan bir hayat yaşar.
However, those who do not know, are unaware of this reality, will live a life without any use and without any benefit.
Bazen de canına kıyar ki ben bu hikmetini bilmiyor. Zannediyor ki böyle.
And there are even people who, because of not knowing why they exist and why they have been created, they commit suicide, complaining about not knowing why they exist.
Ansızın çıktı dünyaya.
They think they just appeared in this world all of a sudden.
Kimse yok.
And they think that there is no one.
Hiçbir şey yok diye.
And they think that there's nothing to live for.
Dolaşıyor.
And they wander around this world without any purpose.
Bilmiyor ki Allah Azze ve Celle var, Allah'a inanması lazım.
And they don't know, are unaware of the reason of their creation being to Allah Almighty and to live and worship Allah Almighty.
Allah'a inanınca bütün hayırlar ona gelecek.
When you believe in Allah Almighty, all kinds of goodness will come to you.
Yok, imansız, hiçbir şeyden haberi.
However, people, they are without faith and they are unaware. They don't know anything.
Yok, inkarcı.
Instead, they deny everything.
Olarak çıkıyor. Ondan sonra da
they live a life in denial.
Hayır bekliyor.
And while they live in denial, they expect to experience goodness or blessing.
Sana nereden hayır gelecek?
But how do you expect to experience goodness or blessing without believing in Allah Almighty?
İsterse bütün dünya senin olsun.
Even if you possessed the entire world,
yine o sıkıntıdan kurtulamazsın.
you will not be able to save yourself from that distress you find yourself in.
Sıkıntıdan kurtulmak için ibadet edeceksin.
In order to save yourself from the troubles and difficulties and hardships you experience, you need to worship Allah Almighty.
İbadet Allah Azze ve Celle'ye tazim edeceksin.
You need to worship Allah Almighty. You need to glorify, honor and revere Allah Almighty.
Peygamber Efendimiz'e tazim edeceksin.
You must show respect to our beloved Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him.
Ki hikmetle yaşayacaksın. Hikmetsiz bir hayat.
You must live a life in awareness of the wisdom, knowing your purpose of creation.
Hiçbir şey yok.
And without that wisdom of knowing that you have been created to worship Allah Almighty, there will be nothing.
Çoğu insanda Annesine babasına da ne için beni bu dünyaya getirdin? Estağfurullah yani.
And people are ignorant to that extent that they even blame their parents, telling them, why did you create me? Estağfurullah.
Anne baba değil ki getiren seni, Allah Azze ve Celle seni yarattı.
It is not your parents that created you. It is Allah Almighty that created you and brought you here.
Onları vesile kıldı.
And it was Allah Almighty who made your parents to be the means for you to enter this world.
Onların bir şey yapacaksan onlara hürmet edeceksin. Onlara
You cannot blame your parents. You must show respect to your parents.
Allah rızası için hizmet edeceksin.
And you must serve throughout your life for the purpose and for the sake of Allah Almighty.
Dünya için olan insanlar annesine babasına zulüm eder.
Those who live their lives only for the purpose of this life, for the sake of this life, they don't show respect to their parents. They insult their parents. They disrespect their parents.
Hakaret eder. Kabahat onların.
And they make their parents responsible for their mischief.
Allah Azze ve Celle sana yaratmasa anne baban nereden getireceksin işte?
But if Allah Almighty didn't create you, your parents, how could they have brought you here?
Yani kolay mı insan yaratmak?
Do you think it is an easy thing to do, to create a human being?
Allah Azze ve Celle'den başka yaratmak şey yok.
No one except Allah Almighty can do such a thing.
Allah Azze ve Celle istediği vakit yaratıyor. Sen
He Almighty Allah does as He wills, and if He desires to create, He creates.
Dünyaya geliyorsun.
And then you enter this world upon the creation, through the creation of Allah Almighty.
Başka şey yok. Sen yok olmayınca olmuyor.
If Allah Almighty says to something to not be, it will not be.
Allah yok deyince olma deyince olmuyor.
And if Allah Almighty says to something be not, it will not be.
Deyince oluyor.
And if Allah Almighty says to something be, it will be.
Bunu da bilmek lazım.
We must know this too.
Hikmetinde dediğimiz gibi ibadet
And the wisdom behind life is to worship Allah Almighty.
için yaratıldık biz.
Our purpose of creation is to worship Allah Almighty.
Allah Azze ve Celle ibadet için.
Worshipping Allah Almighty is the wisdom behind our creation.
Dünya meseleleri onlar mühim şeyler değil.
When it comes to worldly affairs, those are of no importance.
Mühim olan insanın aklına ne için yaratıldık?
What is important and what we should ponder is that we have been created to worship Allah Almighty.
Allah Azze ve Celle'ye ibadet etmek için yaratıldık diye.
And we must always think and concern ourselves about that purpose behind our creation, which is to worship Allah Almighty.
İtikad etmek lazım ki
And we must firmly believe that we must worship Allah Almighty, and that is our purpose of creation solely.
Rahat etsin insanlar.
And then people will find peace with that awareness.
Başka türlü rahatlığı yok.
There is no other way to find peace or comfort.
Oraya koşturur, buraya koşturur, oraya bir şey yapar, şey yapar.
People run here and there, and they undertake this and that.
Bakar ki gene bir rahatlık yok.
But in the end, they will find themselves in a situation where they still don't find any peace or any comfort.
İtminan yok kalbinde.
There's still no satisfaction in their hearts.
İtminan ala bi zikrillah tatma'innul kulub. Sadakallahu azim. İtminan Allah Azze ve Celle'ni hatırlamakla.
It is solely through the remembrance of Allah Almighty that your heart will find peace.
Onu daima zikretmekle olur.
To find satisfaction is through constantly remembering Allah Almighty.
Allah hepimize, insanlara da hidayet versin.
May Allah Almighty guide all people.
O güzel yolu takip etsin ki
May people follow this beautiful way.
Allah herkese açmış bu yolu.
And Allah Almighty has opened this way to everyone.
Sana var bana yok değil de
This way is not just reserved for one person and not for the other.
herkes isteyen girsin bu yoldan.
Whoever desires to do so may follow this way.
Huzura kavuşsun inşallah.
And by following this way, you will, by Allah Almighty's will, find peace and satisfaction.
Ve minallah tevfik. El Fatiha.